possibility for transformation of outward grid with the university. Many also seem to be disintegrating every aspect of one's normative description come under assault of scholars struggle to condense the new corporate vocabulary and capital, but if the university is adapted or absorb contenders that always succeed to do differentiate practice because political positions that converge share little of what all this means is for a university is beyond our power to interpret and advance that this fact will have little bearing in the shape of contestation except to fortify preference for casting itself as oppositional. This false choice manifests as cruel attachment to the theatrical threat of institutionalization. Their politics refusal performs an attachment to institutional transformation that actively prohibits change. Wakeman, 16th conversion of a conversation about institutionalization or magnetic for rehearsing attachment and detachment. This is cruel optimism. Optimism becomes cruel when the object leads to draw attachment actively aims to actively impedes the end that you brought it to. How do we understand it when the attachment is both psychic and political necessity? Our attachment to the university is only possible because we know it will not deliver what we want in this context. The cruelty of our optimism put in form of inoculation against the threat of institutional complacency or so it conceived of God offered a summary of corporate education to panelists are speculating that the university would build as the agency belonged to them. She thought to invoke an institutional delegation no longer optimistically told the panelists work hard to stop that they become agents. They might pose a distinction that emerged between the appropriation and radicality more familiar as the future is figured by distinctly anti-institutional leaning. In this context, the future could be embraced only by resisting institutionalization. It is the part to remake the university. The power scholars want to emphasize power here to draw attention to condition of possibilities that organized question conceal the provocation. Allow panelists to perform an attachment to institutional transformation without having to grapple with institutional power. But what is concerned with normative culture? What intrigued me is the conventionality that accompanies rhetoric, except for radicality resistance, the alternative, the protection of cruel optimism affords of managing the anxiety, political complacency animates our relation to institutionalization. Cruel optimism offers a way to repeat the attachment to political transformation without incurring the risks of failure. The point is not to re-idealize distinction between complacity and institutional insurgency. The disavowal of institutional power anti-capability and prohibits conversations that enhance our effective capability to engage the university. Contradictory but resonance as a political desire. Invoking politics of refusal rhetorically situates the F as anti-normative. Kirby, 15 academic research, regardless of content, is driven by a shared desire to register to perspective and innovative approach to register what is unusual and specific an argument we got, and slice our way through other positions, certain words and rhetorical vices do the work. For us, one of those vices is normativity, lack of restraint, both naturally assigned with others significantly a social differentiator of the negative, regardless of chameleon guys will defy evaluation. The correction taken forward for reversal by focus is why the center of the norm. The rule is accepted as a fixed reference point against a deviation. Change singularity must be measured and understands the special ability to work through pressure circumstances of norms and experimental possibility of privilege afforded the outsider. The psychological investments in anti-normative thought and acts aggrandize agency that aren't detached from the rules of the system but heavily invested and governed by them. Jules 14, complaint against the rule of the norms that commits us symbolic violence. The rule breaker will lessen the relational structure of her subjectivity. The rule breaker is only intelligible in virtue of the existence of the masses of rule follows against which she defines herself. The rule breaker is only in terms of success and failure. The rule breaker enacts self-invention and self-regulation. She knows the rules so well it permits her to violate the rules and enhance her style or exceptionalism manifested in her ability to manipulate the rules to her will rather than have her will constrained by the will of enacting distant from the rules. A rule breaker possesses a grandiose agency where the rule breaker demonstrates a detached understanding of very ideological formation. The producer as if she exempted from networks of power and knowingly breaker rules not to be detached from it but instead heavily invested in and governed by it. The most unique is always emanated from its normalization through mass consumption. Anti-normative approaches to politics sustained capitalist violence. 17 for many rights are insidious. This is taught me that through all ideals I do not believe in the ability to live in ideals. Automatically means ideals are inherently corrupt and formal. Equality of the law may be frequently violated, but the demise of this ideal would have drastic oppressive consequences entirely possible to envision norms that open contentious modifications its regarding attempts to improve the system by running a more inclusive or consistent application would hardly be productive. Negotiations of parts are better than anti-normativity. Anti-normativity presupposes a persistence of liberal values even when engaging in the vain and critique of neoliberalism. Anti-normativity might play right in the hands of capitalism. Capitalism defies limits does not thrive in the absence of current source. Could be a war against capitalist ethos of unmitigated choice. They saturate the neoliberal subject by it's introducing alien elements and experiences as constraining global human rights discourse. It can be used to protect non-Western population. The fact that rights fails as often as to succeed does not make it never succeed. The alternative is to keep calm and carry on. Buford, 15 theorists might learn as much from practice. Conservative agencies, more complex politically distressed practice would prompt us to reconsider what agency means. Seemingly intractable consequences agency need not see through the lens of intrinsically transformation. Agency may be claiming the faint possibility of things being otherwise a repetition of practice, merely keeping one's head bobbing above the water. It's a practice of keeping calm and carrying on brings the question of agency into view. We see the protester and the collectivized subject as equivalent, positioning these figures as legitimate political cuts, a shadow over other legitimate figures in Catherine to cut the student who overcomplies with institutional expectation becomes recognizable as a victim of neoliberal form and implicit partner in perpetuating neoliberal government by failing to be legible that keeps common carrying on intervenes a presupposition register of political effective practices must be key to proactive action make stuff happen to keep common carrying on and continues to hold up an alternative way of thinking about political offering out in the future directed strategy for political transformation but again like when future for political engagement conditions present even suspicious practice to open up neighborhoods of agency. The case Halberstam fits and this is especially key post-Trump and anything so experimental resistance to detailed policy opposition is the only hedge against things getting worse for all marginalized groups. Halberstam 16 Trump's edge for women, people of color, immigrants, the environment, and getting worse for better establish a plan of action where the young and passionate visionaries leadership can outline a detailed opposition with critical way of thinking. We need someone who writes a victory coalition of explicitly leftist platforms who needs smart, informed speakers who understand race, who process persons and government reform through their space, who imagine a better world, function a coalition of women, queers, native people of color, trans people, disabled people need to travel utopian fantasies, small spirals, channels of potential running through the political architectures through which we're imprisoned. The F's anti-power politics are theoretically and historically inefficient at reducing widespread and rapid inequality, and the suspicion of political power reinforces the rabid individualism of neoliberalism. Period. 18. The radical left is giving way to fascist policy experts whose integrated activities coalition tend to prioritize an internal focus motivated by suspicion of potential as the sacrifices action. We lack cohesive and long-term strategy. Radical leftists reject a collective will by developing a single encompassing strategy based on universal principles and opposition with academic difficulty tends to lack extensive historical continuity in our era. That's marked as era.
Sorry, on the gray evidence, where
yes.
is it? Sorry.
Historical continuity in our era.
I'm trying to find it. Historical
it's like near
oh, yeah, I got it. Cool. Wait, like, the part that you said is towards the end?
No, it's towards the beginning.
Yeah, okay, cool. Awesome.
Ready for cross?
Yes.
Cool. How do you define anti-normative?
So it is based on a rejection of conceptualized. So it's based on the F's politics of refusal is that sort of anti-normativity.
Other than just the app is anti-normative, how do you define anti-normative?
So it is based on a rejection of things that are like deemed normative.
So is any kind of protest anti-normative?
Yes.
If all protests are anti-normative, how can we ever enact social change, like within or outside of institutions?
So it's specifically a critique of your conception that being normative is never possibility, or is never like a way to achieve change. It's not a critique of all of the protests, it's a critique of saying that not protesting will never lead to change.
So we should never question norms.
That's not what I said.
Okay. Why is it bad to be anti-normative?
So it's bad to refuse the normativity of, or like to refuse normativity because it like recreates capitalism and
How?
does other.
How does the app do that?
So the ways that like through the rejection of politics and other stuff like that recreates the like capitalist formations. Do you have more?
So I guess our analysis evidence talks about how in order to refuse something, the affirmative sort of recognizing that sort of rules exist. So for example, the politics of refusal, you recognize that the subjectivity exists in the first place, which results in investment into it. And so even though the call may be for to get rid of the fact that there's recognition in the first place, creates that sort of investment, which inevitably turns the case, but results in the same sort of subject formations that neoliberalism would create.
Okay.
Sorry, I need a
Go
question.
ahead.
Your impact is literally just capitalist suffering, right?
Yeah, so it's a turn to the case.
Sounds
yeah. There's a
Okay.
maybe other thing.
Yeah. So if the affirmative doesn't understand itself as exempt from like particular power relations and like doesn't like predicate like this politics of individualism and exceptionalism, like then how does your K interact with our app at all? Because I'm just not sure I understand what the link is other than just this vague like you don't invest in politics and that's bad.
So that's one of them. The other links are based around the belief that being normative or being like tied into those structures can never be radical. That's the like main link.
But also, if you don't use that sort of power politics approach, how does the app solve?
Yeah, so I mean, that's like a separate argument, but the main link is just around the politics of refusal.
Okay.
We'll start pro. Yeah, no, I'm good.
Do you mean water or anything?
No, I'm fine. Alright, stop pro. 223 is, there's only one card, so I'll just send it to the dog.
So there's something left. I have to go down.
Alright. I'm not that tall. It's just gonna be case, T, and then the guy. And there will be like pretty good sized overview, not gonna lie with you. Alright. Is everybody ready?
The resolution is called the recovery from the Trump presidency, and populism has created a liberal desire to engage structurally the defeat of these insidious forms of power that regulate desire and pacify us, redefining beauty as what as that which is recovering from productivity. This regulation has constructed disability through an effective engagement that defines it in terms of production to create the desire to fix broken bodies, and investing in this narrative creates a climb to citizenship that is never actualized because there are always more broken bodies. Our refusal is a complete epistemic disinvestment from current structures of power. Our artistic refusal, like Frida Kahlo and Musumi, allow for individual subversion of power that constructively allows for investment in molecular navigation of politics that can materialize in counter-hegemonic knowledge economies that subvert dominant understandings of power. We don't have to physically create change, but we can do it. We can do it psychologically for bodies that are marginalized. Now, the first impact that we saw for is microfascism. Trump is not a unique rupture in liberal governance, but an extension of status quo politics in disguise. Other presidents have done worse violence. Focusing our energy on liberal governance is a form of microfascism that allows for a continue feeling like fascist leaders like Trump. Only absolute refusal and the participation of liberalism is the best epistemological navigation of the neoliberal desire machine. Now, the second is false hope. The hope of recovery from a dangerous deviation from normalcy has driven the debate community to invest in a simulation of political recovery. Assuming that power can be thwarted through a direct relationship between science signifiers and objects, and this only hopelessly productivizes our bodies. The affirmative disinvests from the hope of progress and recovery. Instead, dwells in the brokenness and disorder and fosters individual methods of resistance. First, on the line by line, the how percent evidence does not flow negative. This is silly. They definitely talk about the way in which otherwise epistemology should have to re-navigate forms of neoliberalism, being able to create their own investments in those. That is the same refusal that the affirmative calls for. Now, they say the second argument, we are a rejection of the radical left, which is what this card is criticizing. We think that the radical left is what has necessarily productivized otherwise epistemologies and made it so that they have been formed into violence through normalcy. Go to framework. First is a framing issue. That framework argues to prove our solvency. The affirmative refusal is the refusal of the perfect obedience of framework as a tool of governance that is meant to enforce. And every time they yell about how we're radically changing debate from what it's supposed to be, that's more proof that our conduct has transformation or potential. The refusal of the 1AC to conform to academic spaces is key to being able to foster alternative knowledge economies. Even if this is only constructed for one person in the room, that's enough to vote half on presumption. And you should understand framework as a form of interpersonal surveillance that forces us to interrogate our relationship to liberalism and cleanse ourselves of that violence. That is a refuse the libidinal desire to reconcile that violence. Now go to the counter-interpretation. The affirmative should develop a method of resistant surveillance that solves stasis, ensures that each team gets existing surveillance policy goods and existing approaches to surveillance policy good, both of which are predictable under the resolution. All of their executive good, power good offense. Also, their interp excludes KVK debate by shutting down after critiques and turns clash between critical literature discouraged and inhibited to resistance by censoring our discourse. And that interp doesn't solve limits. It means that they allow for 100 affirmative, put them in a double bind. A, either they explode the explosion of limits is inevitable, or B, the half doesn't trigger it.